Oz Alashe and Dr. John Blythe are here. And they have delightful accents, and there's a Highland cow. So I'm going to turn it over to them and let them take it away with behavior and risk selection to kick off our track.
Jennifer, thank you so much. Extremely kind introduction, and indeed a brilliant welcome, not just from you, but really for the whole summit. We are delighted to be here. We are rather excited about what this community is doing, what this community can achieve, and indeed what these next couple of days holds for all of us as a community. So thank you. I'm hoping that you can not just hear me, but also see either myself, which might be a bit unfortunate for you. So hopefully you can see John, which will be better, and of course see some slides as well. And really just to welcome you. You've probably been able to detect from certainly my accent, you'll see it reinforced by John's, that we're from a slightly different location to probably where Jennifer and Lance are. We're in the UK at the moment, and so for us it's a good afternoon. For some of you I know it's a good evening, and for many of you I know it's a great and good morning. So really good to see you. We're going to talk to you about a number of things today, but we're really going to center them all around behaviors, security behaviors. And the reason we're going to do that really is probably helpful if I just tell you what I do. So I'm the CEO of CybSafe. We're a behavioral science and data science company that is developing technology to help manage human cyber risk. And I'm joined by Dr. John Blythe, who you will hear from in a bit. John leads our behavioral science research and analysis team at CybSafe. So much of the work that we're going to talk about has really been spearheaded by John and many of his colleagues in the academic community as well as in the industry community. We're delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some information and some exciting open source collaborative work. It's been taking place in the industry for quite some time, and it's been focused on better understanding and influencing security behaviors. And this has taken the form of collaboration over 18 months now, research, development and evaluation of lots and lots of information, resulting in a database, the world's most comprehensive security behavior database, lovingly known as SBEDB. So we're going to just expose and talk to and share about that and make sure that you have access to all of that information, because the information really is there, produced by the community for the community, as Lance likes to describe. And maybe before I do that, I guess it might be useful to kind of remind ourselves why this area is so important. If you think about it, we all talk about and all know that security behaviors are important, but what we really want to talk about is why it's important to be specific, really specific about the security behaviors we're talking about, rather than, as we often are as a community, vague in general. We talk about the importance of security behaviors, but as we'll maybe discuss, we're not necessarily clear about which behaviors we're talking about and why. It's interesting to note that if you ask any security and risk professional, any of us actually at this summit, I suspect, either responsible for or deeply caring about managing human cyber risk, security awareness, behavior change, security culture, call it, as Lance suggested, what you will all cite security behaviors as being one of the most important factors. But we know this makes sense. Many of our organizations face threats. The threats will vary depending on the types of organizations we are, depending on the nature of our business, depending on the threat actors that we may face. The threats may change. And of course, from those threats will be a series of risks. Those risks will be as a result of a number of things that come together. And again, those will vary from organization to organization, although there, of course, will be significant overlap between our organizations. But as far as information security is concerned, and when we look at the people component of information security, the one of the biggest, arguably one of the most fundamental determinants of the risks that we face, are of course how our people behave. So security behaviors are really quite key. But then if you think about the activity we conduct, or the way that we have traditionally thought about security behaviors, and more importantly, the way that we have tried to address, influence, shape security behaviors, actually we've conducted quite a lot of activity that hasn't necessarily had the impact that we want it to have. So whether that's looking and thinking about how well people score in computer-based training, or how many workshops they attend, or webinars or events that they attend, or how many posters that we put up and how many that they get to see, or how many blog posts that we put up and how people are being communicated with and watched, how many funny emails and funny videos being sent, all of these things, all of these really interesting and actually sometimes quite time-consuming interventions, they aren't necessarily delivering the results that we want. Sometimes we're not even clear about the results that we want. If it's for people to be humoured, actually really enjoy it, really have a wonderful experience at the time, then some of those things are really effective. But if it's actually to change behaviour A, B, or C. Sometimes they're less, and we don't really always have that information. So this research exercise was born out of that fact. How do we actually know whether we're having the impact on the security behaviors we're talking about? And in fact, what behaviors are we actually key on, focused on? Which ones do we think are key? As I said up front, this security behavior database is free and open source and accessible by all. It's really quite key because this is a fantastic example of what our community can do when it comes together. And it's a live database. The community is growing every single day. It's a digital compendium that contains information on every single security behavior known to reduce human cyber risk. And it's intended to help the community of security professionals prioritize and influence those behaviors, the behaviors that will have the particular impacts that they want to have on their organization. So we're excited to share it with you, and we're going to talk a little bit more how we can use it as a community to take the guesswork out of much of our own activity. Next slide, please, John. One of the other things that led to the work, the research, the thinking about this was a question that was asked, which was, why are we failing? A number of practitioners actually raised this, but actually then it was being asked by regulators, and it's also still being asked, even to this day, being asked by a number of people across the community, a number of professionals, why are we failing when it comes to security behaviors? And of course, I know that there are some people who will quite rightly say, well, I'm not sure that I am failing, or we are failing, or indeed as a community that we're failing. But that really then forces us to look at what we're trying to achieve. By failing, what do we mean? Well, in this particular case, we're talking very simply about whether or not we are indeed influencing the security behaviors that we think are important. And that was why earlier on I kind of tried to differentiate between attending events or completing training or looking at and watching videos, or indeed even finding those videos or those events or those engagements positive and I guess leaving us feeling in a way as a user that meant that we actually for the first time ever didn't hate our security awareness activity. All of those things are good, but they don't necessarily lead to behavior change. And we know, of course, I don't need to tell this audience, that just because people know what to do doesn't mean they actually go on to do it. So when it comes to interventions, then there is a failure that we have to address. You can see on this slide some other examples or some other reasons why some of the interventions don't succeed. Message fatigue, so that's really now talking to the communication style, or indeed the communication activity itself, because of course the reality is that sometimes people are not communicated well with. Some of the tactics that are often used within the industry, of course, don't necessarily yield the results that we're after, but actually we still do them anyway, and that's because not because we're unintelligent. Of course, as a community we're not. It's often because we don't necessarily connect the dots, which is that actually some things are more effective at changing behaviors than others. And there's actually quite a lot of research and evidence in this space that helps us understand that. For some of us, we're actually a bit scattergun. We're trying to do too much. We're trying to do too much, or we're trying to do too much in a short period of time, or indeed even that period of time might be relatively long, but the fact of the matter is we're not focused. And that brings me back to that point about not being specific about security behaviors. And of course, it's really quite hard to be sure that you're changing or influencing something if you can't measure it. You might assume you are, or indeed hope you are, but as we know, when it comes to risk, hope is not the food of champions. So we definitely need to be a bit more deliberate than that. And then finally, they're listed on, and it's quite an important one, and one that we really do quite enjoy talking about, but probably subject of another conversation. It's about the removal and the addressing of barriers. Actually, in many cases, we're quite often thinking about those driving forces without really thinking about the restraining forces, and therefore not necessarily addressing the right barriers.
Okay, so it's my turn. Good day, everyone, and thank you so much to Sans for having me speak today. Just to unpack a little bit more around one of those key challenges that we see in the community, which is that one of the key reasons why many campaigns fail is that they often jump straight to an intervention when changing behaviour. For example, when a security problem is identified, organisations may turn to awareness-raising activities, often without addressing the correct barriers to a given security behaviour. Very much like what we see on screen here, straight from the problem on the left to the intervention on the right, cutting out that middle bit. But to change behaviour in a way that is sustainable, we first need a really thorough understanding of the problem we are trying to address and the behaviours we are wanting to change. And that requires being more deliberate and specific about security behaviours that we are targeting. And if we don't pick security behaviors that actually matter for the security problems that we're addressing, then it doesn't really matter what interventions we're employing, because we might not actually be reducing security risks. As Oz alluded to, another key issue is that many organizations actually try to do too much within their interventions. And we know that behavior change is massively complex. So trying to change hundreds of behaviors at once, it's just not going to happen. We're far better to hone in and focus on intervening deeply on a few behaviors than it is trying to change lots of behaviors at once, and really focus on trying to build on small successes. So that's why today we're going to be talking about how you can identify the right behaviors for your interventions. And we'll take you through a 3-phase process in helping you prioritize behaviors and some of the tools you can use to help you design better and more effective interventions. And this process covers 3 key stages. The first is, what is the problem that we're trying to address from a behavioral perspective? What are the relevant behaviors? And then finally, what is influencing those behaviors? So let's start with that behavioral problem. The problems that we face as a community are very much focused around the security risks that arise from an employee's behavior. So that might be, for an example, the risk of malware infection caused by an employee not updating their work devices. So an elected approach is often to focus on people's awareness of these different security risks. But we know as a community that in isolation, that's not effective. We need to focus on behaviors, as it's behaviors that ultimately lead to these security risks. So a systematic approach to understanding our behavioral problems has been really specific about 3 things. Firstly, what are the security risks that you are tackling? So you might use standards and frameworks in your organizations to map out your cybersecurity risks. But the second part has been really specific about what are the mitigating behaviors that address these individual security risks? And then thirdly, who are the target individuals, groups of populations involved in those behaviors? So for example, if we were looking at the risk of malware infection, to really articulate that as a behavioral problem, it requires being really specific about who needs to do what, where, and how. So for example, it might be Jack needs to use the password manager on his work device when he creates new accounts on websites. And that's how we start to be really, really specific about our behavioral problems. And when defining behavioral problems, it's really important to emphasize here on the need to focus on systems of behavior. Behaviors don't exist in a vacuum, but they occur within the context of other behaviors that we do, as well as security behaviors and the behaviors of those around us. And they interact as a system. So when considering what behaviors to intervene on, we should think about all the relevant behaviors performed by that target employee or that group of employees. Because if one selects a behavior that is dependent on other behaviors, then when we're designing interventions, we need to take into account that we might be having to target a set of behaviors. So what might seem like a simple set of behaviors, so in this case, James using a password manager, is actually influenced by, as you're all aware, several other people's behaviors. So that might be his manager choosing not to use the password manager. It might be his colleague's behavior who's actually sharing passwords through that application. But it could also be the information security officers who are restricting use of password managers as well. So James is influenced by all those behaviors of other individuals. But it could also be behaviors that are determining James's use of passwords as well, such as his need to access a work system. So it's really important to account for these systems of behaviors within our intervention designs, as it may help us to identify barriers early on around why people can't undertake a specific behavior.
Now, one of the things that was really interesting as it emerged from the research, and also, of course, the view and the responses from the practitioner community that was so heavily involved with this, is that not all behaviors are important in all circumstances. And of course, that's not that surprising, and it's okay. I mentioned that the security behavior database was the most comprehensive compendium, a body of knowledge, as it were, of security behaviors. A list, actually, there's about, I think it's up to 79 at the moment, and the list is growing. And of course, that number will change. Don't focus too much on the list. The fact of the matter is, we all know that one, as John said, nobody in their right mind tries to change 79 security behaviors at any one time. But two, more importantly, for each organization represented here, let alone, of course, across the globe, we all have slightly different areas of focus and maybe slightly different concerns and risks that we need to address. So the group found it very, very useful and very helpful to be able to articulate a priority order for which behaviors were going to be evaluated against, a criteria, as it were. And you can see on the slide here that those criteria are broken down into primary criteria and supporting criteria. In the case of primary criteria, unsurprisingly, the most important thing was impact, or one of the most important things was impact on the security risks we're really quite keen on addressing. And then, of course, closely associated with that was likelihood of change. In some cases, there are some quick wins or some really quite tall orders, and it's useful and worth being aware of those based on the evidence rather than on hunch and guesswork. The supporting criteria, as you can already see, actually nods to some of the work that's already taken place, but ultimately is going to find its way into later versions of the security behavior database, whether that's behavior spillover, such an important consideration when you consider that it's really quite likely that in affecting some behaviors, you may have a significant influence on other behaviors, but yet we often don't take that into account. Suitability, ease of measurement being two other things that again are very useful supporting criteria to consider when selecting and identifying and prioritizing security behaviors. Next slide, please, John. As I said, the digital compendium that we've discussed and talked about, the security behavior database, contains information on every security behavior known to help manage and address and reduce human cyber risk. It's intended as a tool to help prioritize and influence security behaviors. But the best and easiest way to think of it is in the terms of a taxonomy that maps all of these security behaviors onto the risks associated with those behaviors. And of course, a range of other factors that would be therefore beneficial for you to understand. The research and the feedback from the group suggested that this particularly helpful exercise of mapping security behaviors to risks was a really quick way of speeding up the impact that organizations can have, that we as security professionals can have, because for the first time now, very simply, and based on the evidence rather than maybe our own very quick work, and by that I mean the academic and research evidence base, we can now say if these are the risks that we're trying to impact, here are the behaviors that we should consider. We'll come back and give an example of those in a little bit.
So just a little bit more information around how we've developed SubDB. So if you're a bit of a science nerd like me, you're probably interested in how we've actually leveraged some research methods within its development. So one of the key things that I would like to emphasize is that SubDB, we want to really co-design it with the community, and that's what we've done. And as we continue to iterate and develop it over time, we really wanted to address the needs and problems that the awareness community face. So to develop the first version, we've taken a multi-phase approach. So we started by reviewing the academic literature around security behaviors, so any literature published in journal articles, conference proceedings, as well as some of the unpublished literature that we might call grey literature within the academic community. We then reviewed guidance and standards that relate to cybersecurity awareness and behavior risk management, for example, those published by the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, as well as ISO and SANS, to identify all the types of security behaviours that were spoken about within that literature. And then finally, we developed a SubDB panel of academic, government, industry experts who provided community feedback on the behaviours and the mapping within the database, and to also help us identify future features for SubDB. Okay, so now we'll turn to how you can use SubDB as part of that three-phase process, and to help you understand more about your behavioral problems and how you can use it to prioritize security behaviors. So as also mentioned earlier, the first iteration is a very extensive and dynamic collection of information relating to cybersecurity risks and how they link to security behaviors. So as we said, we've got over 70 behaviors within the database. It's very comprehensive, so it'll cover all different types of behaviors that are relevant to your organization. And when it comes to understanding your behavioral problem, SubDB allows practitioners to really prioritize which behaviors to target. So you can group behaviors by their categories. So you might be interested in what behaviors fall under account security, or by their impact on risk-related outcomes. So you might be interested in which behaviors impact most on things like account compromise or data theft. And SubDB really can really help you focus in on and hone in on the behaviors that matter most to your organization and the risks that your organization faces. So Otto's now going to take you through an example of how you can use SubDB.
So in an ideal world, I would be now flicking to my own desktop and of course firing through, going to the SubDB URL, which we will make sure you have access to. We'll post it both in the track channel, in the resources channel, and indeed even in the chat here as well. But if you were to go to the SubDB, again, remember it's open source and it's available for everybody. So this really is a free resource tool that everybody can not just look at and use, but also contribute to and evolve, especially if you see things that you think are missing or need to be included. And then you would be able to see that the security behavior database allows you to select at a risk level or at a behavior level, i.e. you can choose whether you want to focus on behaviors by coming at them top down, which risks are important to me and therefore which behaviors are important, or looking specifically at a behavior and looking outwards and upwards, i.e. I'm interested in this particular behavior and I'd like to know which risks I'm likely to be impacting. In this particular case, we're starting by looking top down. So we're starting by looking at the risk outcome of malware infection. And under the risk outcome of malware infection will be listed a series of security behaviors that would help to reduce the likelihood of malware infection taking place. Next slide, please, John. Taking just one of those particular security behaviors, in this particular case, the security behavior of reporting security incidents, you'll see that the security behavior database has not only prioritized or suggested a priority tier for this particular behavior as it relates to this particular risk outcome, but it's also then gone on to explain why it's important and also any other risks that this particular behavior might impact. This is quite important because we know from the community, from our own work within the community, or indeed actually from the broader community that has been looking at and feeding into and commenting on the security behavior database, it's really important for us to start to talk back to our organizations in terms of managing risk. So of course, gone are the days, or certainly very soon gone will be the days, where it is training or videos or events for the sake of those things. And actually, of course, we should quite lightly, and as Lance showed on the framework, really be focusing on the impact that we're having. And this helps us focus on the risk outcome and therefore the impact that these behaviors have on the risk outcomes.
Great. So this is an example of how you can use SubDB to then work with that prioritization criteria that we outlined earlier. So on this slide, I'm focusing very much on those two key criteria of impact and likelihood of change for the risk of account compromise. So on the y-axis, we have impact on security risk. So those behaviors that appear at the top of your screen here, those are behaviors that impact more on this risk, whereas those at the bottom impact less. And the x-axis, we have a likelihood of change. So how likely it is that we can change that behavior amongst our population. So those behaviors on the right-hand side of your screen are those that are easy to change, whereas those on the left are more difficult to change. An important thing to emphasize here is that we're not saying that all these behaviors are not important, but what we're trying to suggest, what we're arguing here is that they do all contribute to the risk, but some contribute more to the risk than others, and some of them are more difficult to change. And it's all about trying to identify the best bets for our intervention, or as I like to refer to it as the low-hanging fruit of behaviors. So we can use a matrix like this to really focus on what behaviors we should target within our intervention. So it's really those behaviors in that top right corner there, because those are the behaviors that have the highest impact on this risk and are easier to change. So within this example, it is the behavior of using a separate passphrase or password for email accounts. Conversely, the behaviors in the bottom left corner are those which impact less on this risk and have a lower likelihood of change. So in this example, it is following security warnings. So we know that generally that this particular security behavior impacts less on this risk. There's lots of research shown out there about the high false positive rating of security warnings, and a lot of human factors research shows that people typically bypass security warnings because they suffer from message fatigue, and generally security warnings are quite poorly designed. So it's a really, really difficult behavior to change, and it's one that suggests that it's probably not going to get very far within a behavior change intervention. So you can use matrices like these to really hone in on which behaviors you should prioritize within your intervention. And you can use it alongside those secondary criteria of spillover, suitability, and ease of impact to really identify the best bets for your behavior change intervention. And SubDB can also be used as part of your wider behavioral toolkit. So if we go back to that three-phase process that we outlined earlier, You might start with your behavioral problems. So you might use some standards and frameworks. You might use, for example, NIST to really map out the cybersecurity risks that your organization faces. SubDB can then be used to help you understand how those risks link to different behaviors in which you should consider prioritizing. And then once you have your core set of behaviors, you can then move on to focusing on how you might design interventions that are evidence-based. So you might use, for example, a behavior change framework like the behavior change wheel, Mindspace, or whatever behavioral insights tool that you use. So using SubDB within the design of interventions, it can really help facilitate those evidence-based design process. And choosing interventions should be guided by what barriers are preventing security behaviors. And you can use, for example, Combi to understand this. So this is the Combi model developed by Susan Mickey and colleagues at University College London. It's probably my favorite model of behavior change because I think it's a really simple model and really, really useful lens to understand what are the barriers that we're facing to certain security behaviors. So if we take, for example, the one on screen here using a password manager, we can understand where we're looking at a lack of capability, a lack of motivation, or lack of opportunity, because the model argues that for any behavior to occur, whether that's washing hands, wearing face masks, all the way through to security behaviors, we need to have the capability to do the behavior, the motivation, or the opportunity. I'd like to go in a little bit more detail about this model, but I recognize that we're quite short on time, but the idea being here that you can use Combi to really understand whether it's a lack of capability that you're looking at when it comes to password managers, a lack of motivation, or a lack of opportunity. And then once you've understood whether it's one of those key barriers, you can then design an intervention to focus on one or more of those components. And the behavior change wheel is a really useful way to structure thinking around Combi, and I do really encourage people to read that if they're not familiar with that process. And you can use SBEDB to, as we spoke about earlier, really build on those small successes once you've started to establish behavior change. So it can be really useful as part of this three-phase process of understanding, designing, and evaluating and refine. So once you start to determine whether you're seeing changes in people's attitudes and behaviors and assessing what has worked and what hasn't worked. So SubDB can help you systematically iterate your program over time by targeting different behaviors and different security risks and determining future courses of action for your campaigns.
So it's worth noting that one of the reasons why this summit is so powerful, why having two tracks is so important, is that the understanding and the recognition and the realization that actually it's not just about what we communicate or how we communicate, or even the importance of communication, but it's also then the evidence-based approach to the output that we're after, which in this particular case, we're having a conversation about changing behavior. The importance of those things is key. SubDB is the first version as it stands right now, version 1. And as I said, it's a live database that is being constantly evolved by a community of volunteers, which anybody here listening to can sign up to be part of, both from the notifications perspective, but also to contribute to it. As I said, we'll share the URL in a bit, but when you look at version 1, you'll see that there's so much more potential. Some of that potential is shown to you on the screen. Already we've started looking at the metrics and the data sources behind each of the behaviors, which the community will have access to and be able to use and put into best practice, again, free of any cost. The behavioral insights and also the insights as they relate specifically to industry and as they relate specifically to role, really rather exciting. Next slide, please, John. In terms of how it's being received, you've got a few quotes here on the screen, but again, you can see that for yourself. Some people are already using this to help to evolve their awareness, behavior change, and culture programs. And it's really important and really helpful for us to be able to see that as a community and therefore to be able to build on it, a body of knowledge, which I think is the best way of describing it. And next slide, please, John. And that's it, really. It is a solution, a resource, a tool that is for the community. And I guess really what's interesting and notable about it is because it's being built by academics and practitioners together, the evidence base behind every single thing is key. So thank you very much for listening to us. Thank you for letting us tell you about the research and the work and really how to find it. And in particular, thank you for giving us the opportunity to share with you so that you hopefully have the opportunity to join in and benefit from it. Thanks again.